The test begins. The morning sun spilled across the rolling hills that surrounded Alexander Cole's estate, turning the long glass windows of his mansion into mirrors of gold. Inside, the house was alive with quiet movements. Staff hurried through corridors, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and preparing the dining halls as though royalty were expected at any moment. For them, this was routine. For Alexander, it was background noise, the constant hum of wealth that no longer stirred anything in his chest. At 56 years old, Alexander Cole had built an empire so vast that newspapers often struggled to calculate his fortune. Technology, real estate, luxury brands. His name was whispered in boardrooms as a man who could break industries with a single decision. The world respected him, feared him, envied him. But Alexander, standing alone at the tall window of his study, only felt the deep weight of boredom pressing on his shoulders. His riches had bought him everything: yachts, jets, estates, private islands, yet none of it filled the silence inside him. His staff feared him for his cold intelligence, and society painted him as a ruthless shark who believed every person had a price. He had proven it time and again in business. Loyalty could be bought and betrayal could be sold just as easily. To Alexander, human beings were predictable machines powered by greed, and today, he intended to prove it once more. He pressed a button on his desk, summoning his personal aide, Victor Lang, a man who had worked for him for nearly a decade. "Is everything prepared?" Alexander asked without turning from the window. "Yes, sir," Victor replied, holding a small case. Inside were a dozen black credit cards, each gleaming with an almost sinister promise. These were not ordinary cards. They had no spending limit, each one linked directly to Alexander's personal fortune. With a single swipe, the bearer could buy a mansion, a car, or an island. They were keys to his kingdom. Alexander finally turned, his sharp gray eyes falling on the case. "Good, bring the staff into the main hall. Let us see who they truly are." Within the hour, the grand hall was filled. A semicircle of senior staff stood beneath the towering crystal chandelier. Gregory, the butler with impeccable posture and eyes that never stopped calculating. Marcus, the chef whose genius in the kitchen was matched only by his hunger for luxury. David, the chauffeur, whose false modesty always hid expensive tastes. And a dozen others who ran Alexander's world like a finely tuned machine. They stood stiffly, unsure why they had been gathered, trading nervous glances as the silence stretched. At the far end of the line, almost blending into the background, stood Naomi. She was the youngest maid, barely 3 years into service. Her uniform was neat but plain, her shoes slightly worn from long hours on marble floors. She kept her eyes down, as if hoping invisibility might shield her from whatever storm Alexander was about to unleash. Her soft brown skin and quiet dignity set her apart from the others, but in a house of extravagance, she was just another servant, or so it seemed. Alexander entered with his usual commanding presence, every step echoing against the polished stone floor. Conversation stopped at once. His gaze swept across the room like a blade, and one by one, his staff straightened their backs. When he reached the center, Victor stepped forward, opening the case of cards. Gasps rippled through the hall. "These," Alexander began, his voice deep and measured, "are linked directly to my fortune. No limits, no restrictions. Each of you will receive one." The room froze in stunned silence. Gregory blinked rapidly. Marcus's mouth fell open slightly, and even David's polished mask slipped for a moment. Naomi, however, stood completely still, her hands clasped in front of her, as though afraid to touch something so dangerous. "You may buy whatever you wish," Alexander continued, handing out cards one by one. "Consider it a gift, or perhaps a bonus. But know this, every transaction will be visible to me. In time, I will know exactly who you are by what you choose to do." A murmur spread among the staff. Was this generosity or a trap? Some looked delighted, others suspicious, but all of them clutched the cards as though holding the keys to their future. When Alexander finally reached Naomi, she hesitated. "Sir, I don't think I should," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I insist," he said firmly, pressing the card into her trembling hand. For reasons he could not explain, he found himself studying her more closely than the others. There was no hunger in her eyes, no eagerness, only discomfort, as if the weight of the card itself was too heavy. Once every staff member had a card, Alexander stepped back. His thin smile looked more like a predator's grin. "No limits. Show me your hearts. The hall erupted in whispers the moment he left. Some muttered about traps, others about opportunity. Gregory smirked, already imagining the Rolex he had long coveted. Marcus whispered to David about a trip to Monaco. The staff's minds raced with indulgence, but Naomi slipped quietly away, the black card burning a hole in her pocket. In her small servant's quarters that night, she placed it on the nightstand, staring at it under the dim light. With that card, she could solve every problem: her brother's tuition, her grandmother's medicine, the overdue rent notice that weighed on her heart. Yet something inside her resisted. This was not her money. It had not been earned. It was a test, she was sure of it, though she did not know the rules. Meanwhile, in his study, Alexander sat before his computer, watching as transactions began to appear in real time. Watches, jewelry, vacations, indulgences, all exactly as he expected. Each purchase confirmed his belief that people, no matter their polish, revealed themselves through greed. But one card remained silent. Naomi's. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. She hasn't spent a single cent, Victor remarked, scanning the screen. Alexander's eyes narrowed. No, she hasn't. And that, he murmured, is the most interesting thing of all. Temptations and burdens. The days that followed were like a storm of indulgence across the mansion grounds. Within 24 hours of receiving the cards, the estate staff had transformed into a parade of wealth and vanity. Gregory, the butler, strutted through the corridors with a brand new Rolex flashing at his wrist, ensuring that every flick of his hand caught the chandelier's light. Marcus, the chef, boasted loudly in the kitchens about his set of diamond-edged knives, tools so extravagant that no vegetable would ever justify their price. David, the chauffeur, whispered into his phone with a grin stretched across his face, already arranging flights to Monaco, determined to capture photos of himself on the Riviera that would make his friends gasp. The others joined in the frenzy, each racing to indulge desires they had long buried beneath their roles. Designer handbags arrived at the gates, boxes of expensive clothes piled in staff quarters, and the hum of delivery trucks became a constant soundtrack. Laughter filled the servants' hall at night as they compared purchases, raising glasses of champagne bought not for the household but for themselves. It was as if the mansion, once a place of rigid order, had become a carnival of greed. Only one room remained untouched by this chaos: Naomi's. The black card sat silently on her nightstand, its metallic surface reflecting the dim lamplight like a mirror mocking her restraint. She had not swiped it once, not even for a loaf of bread or a bus ticket. Every evening she returned to her small quarters, listening to the others flaunt their luxuries, and quietly folded her uniforms for the next day. She said little, but her silence did not go unnoticed. Still nothing, Naomi? Susan, one of the older housekeepers, asked one afternoon with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She was kind, but could not hide her disbelief. Not even a little something for yourself? A dress, shoes? Naomi shook her head. I don't need those things right now. From across the room, Gregory laughed loudly, loud enough for everyone to hear. Of course she doesn't. She's waiting for the right moment. Probably thinks if she plays saint, she'll get a bigger reward. Don't be fooled, ladies and gentlemen. She's no different than us. Just smarter at hiding it. The staff chuckled, though some shifted uncomfortably. Naomi lowered her eyes, biting back the sharp words that burned in her chest. She had learned long ago that silence was the best shield against mockery. Words wasted on people like Gregory only fueled their cruelty. But what Gregory could not know was that Naomi's restraint had little to do with games or strategy. In the pocket of her apron she carried 2 folded letters. One was the landlord's notice. Final warning: eviction imminent if rent was not paid by the end of the week. The other was from her younger brother, Elijah, a university student chasing his dream of becoming an engineer. Registration closes tomorrow, the letter read. If we don't pay the balance, they'll drop me from the program. But don't worry, I can defer. Just let me know. Naomi had read those words a dozen times, each one cutting deeper, because she knew what defer meant. It meant another year of wasted potential, another delay in breaking the chain of poverty that bound their family. And then there was her grandmother, whose medicines grew more expensive by the month. Some days, the old woman's voice on the phone was strong and playful. Other days, it was weak and trembling, and Naomi would sit awake all night terrified of what tomorrow might bring. All of it, The rent, the tuition, the medicine could vanish with a single swipe of that black card. She could solve it all in seconds. Yet every time she reached for it, her hand froze. This was not her money. It had not been earned. It was bait, a trap dressed as generosity, and her grandmother's words echoed in her heart. What comes too easy leaves just as fast. Meanwhile, Alexander Cole sat in his private study, eyes fixed on the screen that listed every purchase his staff made. Each transaction told a story, and he read them with the cold detachment of a scientist studying insects in a glass box. Gregory's Rolex, Marcus's knives, David's trip, predictable, ordinary, exactly what he expected from the greedy hearts of men and women given too much freedom. But Naomi's card remained, dormant, blank, silent. She's planning something bigger, Victor suggested one evening, glancing at the untouched account. Perhaps she's waiting to buy something grand to outshine the rest. Alexander shook his head slowly, his gaze lingering on her name at the bottom of the list. No, that's not hesitation born of greed. That's something else entirely. And I want to know what it is. In the days that followed, Naomi became the target of subtle cruelty. Marcus teased her constantly, pretending to offer her gifts she couldn't accept. Gregory taunted her openly, suggesting she thought herself better than the rest. Even David, usually indifferent, smirked when he passed her in the hallway, as if her lack of indulgence made her weak. Yet in her quiet moments, Naomi's dignity revealed itself in unexpected ways. When the groundskeeper's daughter, Lily, brought her homework into the servants' hall, it was Naomi who knelt beside her, guiding her through math problems with patience and warmth. When one of the junior maids spilled a vase and was scolded by the estate manager, Naomi silently stepped in, cleaning the mess herself and shielding the girl from further reprimand. She gave without thought, without expectation of return, her kindness flowing as naturally as breath. Alexander noticed. He noticed everything. From the high windows of his study, he saw her bend to help the child. From the monitors of his system, he saw her card remain unused while others drained their balances. And in the stillness of his midnight hours, he found himself staring at that one silent account, wondering why it disturbed him so much. By the end of the week, the staff had spent fortunes. Designer suits, spa retreats, expensive gadgets, all cluttered the servants' quarters like trophies of greed. But Naomi sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the black card on her nightstand, and made a decision. Tomorrow she would use it, but not in the way anyone expected. The first choice. The morning broke with a heavy gray sky, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the city with a weight of unspoken tension. Naomi woke before dawn as always, her alarm buzzing softly at 4:30 a.m., but today felt different. Today she had resolved to do what she had avoided for days. Today she would finally use the card. It had burned on her nightstand like a cursed jewel all week, and though she had resisted its lure, her burdens had grown heavier with each passing day. The rent was due, her brother's registration deadline was upon her, and her grandmother's medication costs were piling into an impossible mountain. She had no more time to hesitate. Yet as she dressed in her plain black uniform, tying her apron with hands that trembled more than usual, her heart whispered a different kind of warning. She could walk into the nearest luxury store and buy herself freedom from every problem, or she could do something else, something that would not be about herself at all. Her grandmother's words haunted her. What comes too easy leaves just as fast. If you take, do not forget to give. By mid-morning, she approached the estate manager, Mrs. Wellington, requesting leave for a family emergency. The woman raised an eyebrow, always suspicious of excuses, but allowed it with a clipped nod. Naomi accepted the lost wages quietly, took her coat, and left the mansion through the side gate. The card weighed in her pocket like a stone, each step toward the city, making her feel as though she were carrying a secret that did not belong to her. Instead of walking toward the district where glass towers gleamed with boutiques and luxury cars lined the streets, Naomi boarded the bus that rattled toward the oldest part of town. Here the sidewalks were cracked, buildings stood in need of repair, and the air carried the stubborn resilience of people who survived with little. She stepped off at a stop near a small pharmacy, the kind with faded signs in the windows promising discounts on generic medicine. The bell above the door jingled faintly as she entered. Behind the counter stood an elderly pharmacist with silver-framed glasses sliding down his nose. He looked up, surprised to see a maid in a modest uniform in his store so early. "Can I help you?" he asked gently. "Yes," Naomi said. Her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. She unfolded a list she had written the night before, her handwriting neat though her fingers shook slightly. "I need to fill these prescriptions for my grandmother, and I'd also like to cover any prescriptions that people have left unpaid, the ones waiting because they couldn't afford them." The man blinked, stunned. "That could be quite a lot, miss. We have at least a dozen on hold." "That's fine," Naomi replied, sliding the black card across the counter. "Please just tell them an anonymous donor covered it." For a moment, the pharmacist stared at the card. Anyone who had worked in customer service long enough recognized what that kind of card meant. Unlimited wealth. Billionaires carried those. Yet here it was, in the hand of a maid with worn shoes and a uniform that had clearly been washed hundreds of times. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, almost hesitant to touch it. "Yes," Naomi said firmly, "but please don't tell anyone it was me." The man's hands trembled as he processed the transactions. One by one, the debts disappeared from his screen. Mrs. Green's heart medication, the Williams boys' asthma antibiotics, Mr. Chun's pain relievers. Families who had been rationing, waiting, or suffering now suddenly had what they needed. Naomi wandered the aisles as he worked, filling a basket with bandages, vitamins, over-the-counter medicines, and notebooks for children. These were not luxuries, they were necessities, the invisible treasures that kept families alive. When she returned to the counter, the pharmacist whispered, "Miss, this comes to over $3,000. Naomi's hand shook as she signed the receipt. It was more money than she had ever spent in her life. Yet it brought a strange calm instead of guilt. "Thank you," she said softly, gathering her bag. "Please, just tell them someone cared." When she stepped back into the cold air, she felt lighter, though the card still pressed against her chest with the weight of what it could still do. She walked 6 blocks to the next destination, St. Mary's General Hospital, the public hospital where she had once sat holding her grandmother's hand after the diagnosis that had nearly broken their family. The walls inside were worn, the linoleum scratched from decades of footsteps. But this was where the city's poorest came when they had nowhere else to turn. She went straight to the billing office, where a tired clerk sat behind glass windows. "I want to pay off some accounts," Naomi said quietly. "Not my family's. I want to cover those who are about to be sent to collections. Families with children, if possible." The clerk blinked at her as though she had spoken in another language. "You want to pay strangers' bills?" "Yes." Within minutes, she was seated across from the department director, a stern woman named Ms. Howard. Her eyes kept darting to the black card on the desk, suspicion written across her face. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why would a maid want to pay off random accounts?" Naomi's voice was steady. "Because they need it, and because I can." Ms. Howard ran the card for a dollar test. It cleared instantly. Her expression shifted. "How much are we talking about?" Naomi swallowed hard. "As much as I can. Enough to give families a fresh start." For the next 2 hours, she sat in that office while account after account disappeared from the hospital's burden. Mothers who had been skipping appointments for their children. Fathers who had been working double shifts to cover debts they could never escape. Elderly patients who had quietly accepted they would never pay their bills. Naomi's hand ached from signing receipts, but her heart grew lighter with every stroke of the pen. By the time she walked out of the hospital, the card had covered tens of thousands of dollars, yet Naomi felt no guilt. Only peace. What she did not know was that back at the mansion, Alexander was watching. Every purchase made with his cards pinged his system in real time. And when Naomi's list appeared, he leaned forward in shock. The pharmacy, the hospital, essential goods, medical debt, not a single item for herself. For the first time in years, Alexander Cole's hand trembled as he set down his glass of scotch. Victor, standing beside him, tried to rationalize it. "Perhaps she thinks this will impress you, sir. A performance of charity." Alexander shook his head slowly, eyes locked on the screen. "No, this isn't performance. This is who she is." That night, Naomi returned to the estate quietly, slipping into her room before the others could see, but the staff were already buzzing with rumors. Gregory had overheard that she had gone into the city. Marcus sneered about her secret shopping spree. They laughed as they listed what she might have bought. cheap dresses, maybe shoes, or finally some jewelry. But Naomi sat alone in her small room, her receipts tucked into her pocket, her heart steady. She knew what she had done and she needed no one else to know. In the highest room of the mansion, however, Alexander sat in silence long after midnight, staring at the one staff member who had not proven him right, but instead shattered everything he believed about loyalty, greed, and wealth. For the first time in his life, the billionaire was not the one conducting the test. He was the one being tested. The confrontation, the mansion felt different that week. Though the hall still gleamed with polished marble and chandeliers scattered light across the ceilings like fractured stars, a tension lingered in the air, invisible but undeniable. The staff continued to flaunt their luxuries. Gregory's wristwatch seemed to tick louder with every second he waved his hand in front of the others. Marcus sharpened his diamond-edged knives as though preparing for battle rather than cooking. And David regaled anyone who would listen with details about his upcoming trip to Monaco. Yet beneath all their laughter and posturing there was a whisper of unease. Naomi had returned from her day in the city, and though she said nothing of what she had done, the silence surrounding her was louder than their boasts. They mocked her, of course. Gregory made sly comments in the servants' hall about her cheap taste, insisting she must have gone to discount shops rather than luxury boutiques. Marcus joked that she had probably spent her fortune on cleaning supplies and soap. Even Susan, the kinder housekeeper, gave her curious looks as though struggling to understand why she never spoke of her purchases. Naomi kept her head down, her quiet smile unchanged, and folded linens with the same care as before. But Alexander Cole could not keep silent any longer. For days, he had watched the transactions flow across his screens. Each one had confirmed what he had always believed about people, that beneath the mask of civility, greed was the truest language of mankind. Yet Naomi had undone all of it with a single act of defiance, not by refusing the card, but by using it for purposes that did not enrich herself. Instead, she had poured his wealth into strangers, into lives she did not know, into debts she would never see paid back. And that unsettled him more than he was willing to admit, even to himself. Late one evening, when the last of the staff had retired to their quarters, Alexander stood in his study, staring at the glowing list of purchases on his monitor. Naomi's name sat at the center of it all, a quiet storm that had upended the foundation of his beliefs. He pressed a button on his desk. "Send her to me," he told Victor. Moments later, a soft knock came at the door. "Enter," Alexander commanded. Naomi stepped inside hesitantly, her uniform neat, her hair pinned back, her posture straight but humble. She looked around the study as though the walls themselves might be listening, and when her eyes finally met his, she saw not anger in his face, but something far stranger, curiosity. "Do you know why I called you here?" Alexander asked, his voice low and steady, though his heart thudded harder than usual. Naomi shook her head. "No, sir." He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "Sit," she obeyed quietly, folding her hands in her lap. Alexander leaned forward, his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed on her as though trying to pierce through the calm mask she wore. "You spent the card," he said slowly. "Finally." Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir. But you didn't spend it on yourself." His voice hardened, edged with disbelief. "You didn't buy a dress, or shoes, or jewelry, not even a new home or a car. Instead, you walked into a pharmacy and paid for strangers' medicine. You sat in a hospital and erased debts that had nothing to do with you. Why?" Naomi's voice was calm, but her words carried a weight beyond her years. "Because they needed it more than I did." Alexander's brow furrowed. "That's not an answer. You had the chance to solve your own problems. Don't think I don't know about them. Your overdue rent, your brother's tuition, your grandmother's treatments. I have people who know everything about everyone in this house. And yet you chose to give away what could have saved you. Explain that to me." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fireplace in the corner. Then Naomi spoke, her eyes steady, her voice steady despite the storm she felt inside. "Because money is only useful if it heals, not if it blinds. If I had used it all on myself, it would have helped for a while, yes. But it would not have changed who I am, or the world I live in. And if I can use it to ease suffering, even for strangers, then it means something. Otherwise it is just paper and metal pretending to matter." Alexander leaned back in his chair, stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not board members, not competitors, not even so-called friends. Everyone he had ever known had worshipped wealth, either chasing it or bowing to it. Yet this woman, this maid, spoke of it as though it were dust, something fleeting and hollow unless put to noble use. "You think you're better than the others, don't you?" Alexander asked, his voice quieter now, almost searching. Naomi shook her head. "No, I don't think I'm better. I think I was raised to believe that when you have enough to help, you should. My grandmother taught me that, and my brother reminds me of it every day. I'm not better, sir. I'm just trying to be true to what I believe." For a long time, Alexander said nothing. He turned his gaze toward the tall window beside his desk, watching the night settle across the estate grounds. For the first time in decades, he felt uncertain. All his life, he had built his empire on the certainty that people could be bought, that every loyalty had a price. But Naomi had slipped through the cracks of his calculations. When he finally looked back at her, his eyes were softer, though he tried to hide it. "Do you know what the others say about you?" he asked. Naomi's lips curved into a faint smile. "That I'm foolish, that I'm pretending, that I think I'm better than them." "And you don't care?" "I care," Naomi admitted, "but not enough to change what I believe. Their laughter doesn't pay bills. Their cruelty doesn't heal sickness. So why should I trade my peace for their approval?" Alexander sat in silence, studying her face. He had spent years surrounded by power, money, and deception. But in Naomi's steady gaze, he saw something he had almost forgotten existed: honesty without agenda. Finally, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand, though his voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Go. Return to your duties." Naomi rose, bowed her head respectfully, and left the study. When the door closed behind her, Alexander exhaled slowly, sinking deeper into his chair. For the first time in years, he felt shaken, not by a business rival, not by a market collapse, but by a maid who had dared to use his own wealth to teach him that everything he believed about people might have been wrong. As the night deepened, he sat alone in the glow of his monitors, staring at the silent list of transactions. Around him, his empire stretched across continents, but for the first time it felt fragile. He realized that Naomi had not been the one tested at all. He had been, and he was failing. The true lesson, the storm that had been building for weeks, finally broke. It did not come in the form of thunder or lightning, but in the small, quiet moments that seemed ordinary to everyone else but shook Alexander Cole to his core. He had spent his nights staring at screens filled with transactions, the digital pulse of greed running across his fortune. Yet his mind returned again and again to one figure: Naomi, the maid who had not followed the rules of his game. The other staff had begun to unravel under the weight of their indulgence. Gregory's Rolex seemed less like a prize and more like a shackle. The man wore it constantly, terrified that someone might not notice his acquisition. Marcus grew obsessive with his knives, spending hours in the kitchen as though their brilliance could somehow sharpen his worth. David's tales of Monaco became hollow, his eyes darting nervously each time Alexander passed by, as if wondering when the punishment for his arrogance might fall. Their laughter grew thinner each day, stretched over the fear that the test they had so eagerly embraced was not what it seemed. Naomi, however, moved through the mansion with the same grace as before. She polished the silver, dusted the corners, and tended to her duties with a calmness that made the others uneasy. They whispered behind her back, accusing her of scheming, of trying to appear virtuous in order to secure some hidden reward, but she never answered their taunts. She knew that their words had no power over her peace, and her silence only deepened their resentment. It was on a gray morning, with rain tapping softly against the tall windows of the estate, that Naomi's burdens finally threatened to crush her. She had received another call from her landlord. The rent could no longer wait. Her brother Elijah sent a message saying that the university would not hold his registration beyond the week. And her grandmother's health had taken a turn for the worse. The doctor insisted that a new round of treatments was necessary, treatments far more expensive than anything they could afford. Naomi sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the black card lying on the nightstand, and for the first time she allowed herself to weep silently into her hands. She had used the card for strangers, and she did not regret it. But now the weight of her own family's suffering felt unbearable. What Naomi did not know was that Alexander had been watching. not just through the lens of transactions, but through the quiet surveillance he had built into every corner of his estate. Cameras had captured the moment she helped the gardener's daughter with her homework, the moment she took blame for another maid's mistake, the moment she slipped away with the card to do something no one else had the courage to imagine. And now, as he saw her sitting in her small room, shoulders trembling with silent tears, something inside Alexander cracked. That evening, he summoned all the staff to the main hall once again. The chandeliers blazed above them, their light reflected in the polished marble floor, but the atmosphere was heavy with dread. The staff stood in a semicircle as before, though this time their eyes were not filled with curiosity, but with fear. Naomi stood near the end, as always, quiet and unassuming, her eyes red from crying, though she tried to hide it. Alexander entered slowly, his steps echoing through the silence. He carried nothing in his hands this time, no cards, no case, no prizes. Only his voice filled the vast hall when he spoke. "When I gave you those cards," he began, his tone sharper than glass, "I told you I would learn who you truly are. And I have." A ripple of unease ran through the group. Gregory shifted uncomfortably. Marcus swallowed hard, and David clasped his hands together as if in prayer. "I saw greed," Alexander continued, his eyes sweeping across them. "I saw vanity, arrogance, and indulgence. You revealed yourselves exactly as I expected." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But one among you proved me wrong." The staff turned toward Naomi, some glaring, others scoffing, but all of them knew who he meant. Alexander stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her. "Naomi," he said, his voice lower now, almost reverent. "While the rest of my staff squandered their chance on trinkets and trophies, you walked into a pharmacy and freed strangers from the chains of debt. You walked into a hospital and gave families hope they had lost. You used my wealth to do what I have never done, to give without expecting anything in return." Naomi's cheeks flushed, but she kept her gaze steady. "I only did what I thought was right, sir." Her humility cut deeper than any accusation could have. Alexander's chest tightened, and for the first time in years the billionaire felt his throat constrict. "Do you know what I realized?" he asked, his voice softening. "That I was never testing you. I was testing myself, and I failed." The staff shifted, their faces stunned. Gregory's mouth opened, but no words came. Marcus looked down, ashamed. David's hands trembled. The hall, once filled with pride and arrogance, now felt smaller, as if Naomi's quiet truth had drawn all the air from it. Alexander turned back to her, his expression stripped of the cold mask he had worn for decades. "From this day forward, you will no longer live in that small room. You will not worry about rent or tuition or medicine. Your family will have what they need, not as charity, but because you reminded me of what wealth is meant for." He drew a deep breath, his voice breaking slightly. "You taught me that real wealth is not measured by what we keep, but by what we give." Naomi's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise, but she quickly lowered her gaze. "Sir, I don't need rewards. I didn't do it for that." "I know," Alexander replied. "That's why you deserve it more than anyone else." The hall was silent, the staff unable to speak. Some looked ashamed, others resentful, but none could deny the truth that had been laid bare before them. For once the mansion was not defined by its luxury, but by a lesson that echoed louder than the ticking of Gregory's watch or the clinking of Marcus's knives. Later that night, as Naomi sat with her grandmother on the phone, tears of relief streaming down her face while Alexander's resources arranged her treatments and Elijah's tuition, she realized that nothing in her life would ever be the same. She had not sought power or riches, yet somehow by staying true to her heart, she had changed the life of the richest man she had ever known. And in his private study, Alexander Cole stood by the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. For the first time in his life he did not feel empty. The empire he had built suddenly seemed less like a monument to himself and more like a tool that could finally matter. Naomi had given him something no amount of money had ever bought: clarity and the first fragile taste of peace. The test was over. But the lesson would remain forever.